Prayer is accessible to anyone willing to open their heart. And like many things in life, it gets better and deeper with practice. Join Sycamore Creek for a 3-week series in November called Learning to Pray. You'll gain an understanding of what prayer is, how to overcome common challenges, new creative ways to pray, and how prayer can transform all of us when each of us make it a regular practice. Learn to Pray with Sycamore Creek.
Mark, have you ever had a friend who's just gone out of their way to do something really thoughtful for you?
I have.
Yeah.
How about you?
Yeah, I have a friend in Richmond, Virginia. We've been friends for about 10 years. We became friends before my daughter was born.
Okay.
So between Liam and Anya. And we've never lived in the same state.
Never in the same state?
Never.
Okay.
Our husbands were both on staff with the same college ministry. And so we just became friends through that. And then our friendship really deepened. We had a shared experience of having miscarriages. And we just supported each other through that. And so it sort of started with text messages. And then it went to Voxer, which is an app that you can send voice messages to each other.
I'm glad you explained that because I've never used it myself.
And now we mostly converse on Marco Polo, which is a video message app. And I looked back at the last couple of months and I think we send usually about 20 messages altogether. So a couple of times a week we'll send each other messages and they might be 5 minutes, they might be 20 minutes if we've got a lot going on. But it's just a way that we've stayed connected. We just check in with each other. How's it going? What's going on? And last year, around this time, I was experiencing some difficult things and she knew about what was going on and offered to set up a virtual happy hour. So it was one of those moments where she knew that I needed more than just a impersonal check-in. We needed to be able to talk kind of face to face. And so she set that up and we just spent a couple of hours talking together and she was supporting me. And then over the next few months, she's checked in since then to say how's that going and what's going on and how are you doing? And I just really felt cared for her in the way that she cared for by her and how she responded to that. So what about you? Do you have a story kind of like that?
I do, and I can relate to your story because I think sometimes as we're going through being a pastor, there's stuff that we experience as pastors that can be really isolating.
Yeah.
And to have a friend, even if they're in another state, where you can process a little bit what's going on, you get some support. It's super helpful. I think back and I think through my time of being a pastor, and there's certain weeks where you're I can't believe this is happening to me.
I literally can't believe this is my life right now.
Yes. There's just stuff that you get exposed to as a pastor where you're around people and situations and things that are just really outside the norm.
Yeah.
And it's both a privilege and sometimes it's really heavy. And I can think back a year and a half ago, I had a really unique pastoral care situation where I was pinching myself, I can't believe this is happening right now. And there was a situation in our church that involved church administration, which, executive pastor, not exciting, but also really challenging. And how am I going to figure this out? And then there was another situation that involved caring for people and policy. And I was oh, how are we going to figure this out? And it was just one thing after another thing after another thing in a given week. And I reached out to one of my friends and was just giving him just a little small bit of what was going on. And it was so helpful for me to be able to share with him what was going on. Well, later on that day, I'm at my house and I'm exhausted. It's been just a week where everything has felt like it's coming at me. And the doorbell rings and I go and answer the door and my friend is there and he has a beer in his hand. A beer.
One single.
A beer. And he had thought of me and he knew that I would enjoy it. And so he was just dropping it off at my house. I love craft beer, super big beer fan. And he just dropped it off and was I know it's been a tough week and turned around and left. And I loved it because we had talked earlier. I didn't need to talk or process anymore. But the thoughtfulness of the beer, the beer was it was perfect in that moment. I really felt cared for and supported.
Yeah. So, I mean, I shared a story about like my friend who lives in Richmond. We do have pretty close friends here in Lansing, but we've lived here for a little over 2 years, and it takes time. It takes a
does.
lot of time to build close friendships. And what we'll find today as we're talking about prayer is that tending our relationship with God is a lot like tending a friendship. It is. There's a lot of similarities in how we like grow our friendships and care for our friends in how we are in relationship with God. And we'll find that there's times that like being in relationship with God requires some intentionality, like dropping off a craft beer for someone. And sometimes it can happen sort of unintentionally where we're just like friends with people and things happen. But before we get into all of that and what that means to be friends with God, let's stop here for a chat question. Can you think of a time when a friend went out of their way to care for you? Take a minute and talk about it.
Mikkel, today we are wrapping up our series, Learning to Pray. It's a series that's based on a book of that name, Learning to Pray, by James Martin. He's a Jesuit priest, author. He's written some fantastic books, and a reminder that, again, Jesuits are an order within the Catholic Church. And this series is part of our series of series on the Sermon on the Mount. We're doing this 18-month-long deep dive into the Sermon on the Mount here at Sycamore Creek. And learning to pray is just a part of that, and it's all based in the Sermon on the Mount. Now, the first 2 episodes in this series focused on the reality that everyone can pray. That's what we talked about. Everyone can pray the first week. And then the second week, we talked about challenges.
Right.
Last week was challenges in our prayer life. And today we're going to talk about the ways that we can be praying without knowing it. And this, I hope everyone is encouraged by what we're going to talk about today.
I think so. A theme that I've noticed throughout the series is that we've talked a lot about relationships, sometimes marriages or friendships or other things like that. Yeah. And I think that's just a really helpful way, a helpful metaphor for thinking about how we interact with God or with Jesus, is that it's a friendship, it's a relationship. And so today we're going to be using friendships as our metaphor, and because a really helpful way, the way you think about friendships can help you think about and deepen your relationship with God. Because the thing is that a relationship with God, it doesn't depend on us. It doesn't actually depend on us like doing or being or saying the right thing. James Martin quotes William Barry in his book saying that God's offer of friendship does not depend on our significance, but solely on God's desire for us. So God's love doesn't rely on us.
That's such
which is really good news, especially as we think about prayer and all of the pressure that we feel to pray the right way. Like, actually, God really wants to be in relationship with us. God desires to be in relationship with us. So we're going to talk about some of the things that are required to tend our relationships, even while knowing that like we're not earning that relationship, we're not working for that relationship. We're working out of love that we're already experiencing from God, because God already wants to be in relationship with us.
That's important for us to frame everything we're talking about in terms of that. So in the Sermon on the Mount, which is found in Matthew's account of Jesus' life, Jesus talks about prayer, and he says this to his followers: "And when you pray, do not be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray standing in the synagogues and on the street corners to be seen by others. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward in full. But when you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is unseen. Then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. And when you pray, do not keep on babbling like pagans, for they think they will be heard because of their many words. Do not be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you ask him."
So when I think about Jesus' words here and then connect them to that metaphor of friendship, I think there are at least 2 things that we can think about in friendship here. And these are barriers to true friendship.
Okay.
One is when you don't try at all. And the other
That's not helpful.
is when you try too hard.
That's not helpful either.
Right.
Let's not do that.
So good friendship falls somewhere in between, not trying at all and trying too hard. And maybe I think that's part of what Jesus is getting at here when he's talking about prayer. He starts out, and when you pray. So there's an assumption here that you're praying, that you're trying. Because if you're not, we're not praying. Yes. Right? And that would be not trying at all. So like there's somewhere in between where we're like, we're not trying, but also we're not trying too hard and then getting too showy and like using all these words and babbling like pagans and that kind of thing. So I bet that we'll find when we are in the not too intentional space that actually we're praying sometimes without even realizing it. Okay. Which is sort of what we're talking about today. So in that space between not trying at all and trying too hard, what do we do?
Okay, let's talk about that. So I think in good friendships, good relationships in general, this is true with prayer too, a relationship with God, it's going to require time. Time. And I think this is probably not earth-shattering. Most of us have intuited this at some level, that a relationship requires time. And we recognize that the longer that we're friends with someone, there's a deepening of the relationship that happens with time. And there's simply no substitute when you're in friendship with someone for large amounts of time spent together. Yeah. We need that time. And that time it adds up to a meaningful relationship.
Yeah. One of the things that I've noticed as I moved here to Lansing a couple of years ago is how many people I talk to who are still in friendships with people they knew in high school. Like they're retired. Yeah. And they're still in like friendship and relationship with people that they knew from high school. That's a long time to be friends with someone. I think I'm like Facebook friends, like half a dozen people from high school, and I don't talk to any of them. Yeah. But like, yeah, we know that like friendships take time, but how much time really does it take?
That's a great question, and we're going to take a bit of time to answer that question.
What you did there.
About time. Yeah, and I'm going to check my notes on this because we're going to consult some research. Yay, research. According to evolutionary psychologist Robin Dunbar, she's at the University of Oxford. It shows that we really can be close to about 5 people. 5 people is about the sweet spot for having like really
your best
close
friends,
friendships. More than that is just pretty unlikely. And then there might be about 15 people that we call good friends, maybe about 50 people who might consider a friend in some way. And then really 150 people is the absolute limit of having meaningful friendships, meaningful relationships with people where we can handle that.
That's still a lot of people.
That is a lot of people.
That is a lot of people. Okay, so Jeffrey Hall is a professor of communication studies at the University of Kansas, and he was inspired by this research, and he wanted to put some numbers to it. So he took this research and then built on it and found that it takes about 50 hours, 50 hours of interaction to move from acquaintance to casual friend, 90 hours to get to friend, and more than 200 hours to qualify as a like close friend, a best friend.
Whoa, that's a
200 hours
investment in time.
So like, let's break that down. 50 hours for a casual, that's like a 2-hour hangout once a week for 6 months. Okay. So with a lot of intentionality, you can have a friend in about 6 months.
Yes. 2 hours a week.
2 hours a week. 90 hours for a regular friend. That's a 2-hour hangout once a week for about a year. 200 hours to become a close friend. That's a 2-hour hangout once a week for 2 years. Or you could do like 8 days straight, which is a lot of time to take together.
Okay.
That takes significant investment. Whenever I think about these numbers, I think about how when my husband Nathan was on staff at a college ministry, they intentionally planned like a new student retreat for the first month or two after school started, so that like you sort of there was a catalyst for building these relationships and getting some of those intentional and unintentional hours in you get like 50 hours, all at one time. Yep.
And again, we're talking about time. It's not just the number of hours you spend together. Again, we're looking for that sweet spot between like trying and not trying. And it really makes a difference how you spend those hours, that time together. Some adults have reported spending hundreds of hours with their colleagues, like at work, but they still consider those people to be acquaintances because though they've spent hundreds of hours together, they haven't really been intentional about developing relationships with each other. It doesn't automatically make you friends to just spend time together. We really do need to find that sweet spot of trying and not trying, and it takes intentionality to get there. And when I think about my closest relationships, in those there is a trying and not trying, where I don't have to be intentional all the time.
Yeah, it seems to me like some of that, I don't want to say all of the intentionality is front loaded, but there is like a period of time at the beginning of a relationship where you're really just trying to get to know each other. And like, you need those intentional hours, maybe a higher percentage of them at the beginning. And then as time goes by, like you still need the intentional hours, but maybe not to be intentional all the time. Nathan and I, we've been married for like 18 years almost. And we call it parallel play when we're like in the same room and he's doing something and I'm doing something else. And so we're not like interacting, we're not doing the same activity, but we're sharing space together and like just being present to one another. And that's sort of like an unintentional way of spending time with each other.
Jane and I parallel read.
Yeah,
exactly. We're not reading the same book, but we're in the same room. Both reading.
Yeah. I think our prayer lives can be like this a little bit too, where we can have some intentional prayer time where we're like setting aside this time every day, the same time or the same activity. I'm praying while I'm doing that. Yeah. But then there can be other kind of unintentional times where you're noticing the presence of God in a new way. And that's a kind of prayer. Your intentional time could be like going on a spiritual retreat as well. Like that's another way of like setting aside that intentional, intense time.
Yeah. I think again, what we're getting at is sort of a balance of intentional and unintentional. And your unintentional time with God, it could be something like those moments where you go outside and you just notice how still it is outside. And you become aware of how big our world is. And you notice the beauty that is around you in our world. And it could even be where you're actually outside, but it could be just looking out your car window and all of a sudden you're just grateful for this world that we live in. That can be prayer.
Yeah.
And prayer is really, it's just time with God. And that time with God could be intentional, but it can also be unintentional. And, good friendships and good relationships require both intentional and unintentional time. So we have another question for discussion. And our second question for discussion today is this: what's your favorite way to spend time with a close friend? Let's take a moment. Let's turn to someone next to you and let's talk about that.
So good friendships and our relationship with God require time, and they also require openness.
Okay.
So that can be like open to learning new things about God, open to our relationship with God changing, open to being honest and vulnerable with God, open to listening to God. These are all ways that we can be open with God. A good relationship requires all of those things. We already talked about how like you need to spend time to get to know a person you're in relationship with.
You do.
We need to do that with God too, and be open to learning about God. We also can be curious about what God thinks about our current situation. We wonder about how God moves and works in the world. We wonder about how God's character is showing up in people around us. All of that is prayer, and it can change over time. And that's also part of the openness.
It does. I think it's helpful to think of, again, human relationships here. And I think of when I first met my wife, Jana, I was just intensely curious about her when I first met her. We had these super long conversations that ate up just huge amount of times getting to know each other. And it's just discovering the different experiences that we'd had, what our interests were, what our passions were, some of the areas of woundedness that we had. Now, Jan and I started dating when we were in high school. And there's a picture that we have up on the screen where we look like babies. We didn't have a whole lot of life experiences at that point to catch up on. And yet it's amazing how much time we could spend on the phone, pulling the cord into our room and on the corded phone, chatting with each other and using up the phone line.
Were you blocking the internet at that point, or is that come later?
Internet. You're making me date myself here. Now, though, Jan and I have been married for over 24 years. We've been together for over 28 years. We don't have a whole lot of figuring out who the other person is to do. And so our conversations have shifted. One of our favorite things to do is we go for a nightly walk together. And it's a pretty lengthy walk. Jan and I like to walk together. And we just talk about our day, and we walk the other person through it, what we experienced, what we felt, what we're worried about in the midst of that. And then we might talk some about our future and what's going on, but we don't have those conversations as much about our past anymore because we've shared it with each other. And I think, just like with prayer, we're still open to each other, but the openness changes over time.
Yeah. And your whole relationship is maturing over time. I think openness with God also requires honesty with God. Even though God already knows what's going on in our lives.
Yeah, God does.
God still wants to be in relationship with us. God desires that. So being honest with God, putting our experiences into words, all of that is helpful, both for us personally, but also to tend that relationship. I think it's fun to let people to let people know that it's okay to cuss in your prayers.
God can handle it, huh?
God can handle that. You can say, God, this has been a shitty day. And that's okay. If that's the best descriptor for your day, if that's really where you're at, well, you can say that to God. That's not going to shock. He's not.
I know. God will be like, I've never heard anyone say that before.
I've never heard that word before. What are you talking about? There are so many different ways to pray. And just because we've provided people with these written out prayers that are really helpful sometimes, that's not the only way or the right way. It's not a formula. Sometimes all you can say is, this has been really effing hard. And that's what you got. And that's okay.
Yeah, we also practice openness to God when we discover new things about God through other people. James Martin writes in his book, letting others tell us about their experiences with God is like being introduced to a friend's friend, or like discovering something new about a friend you already know. I absolutely love this idea, and it's actually one of my favorite things about being a pastor. But I have to admit, I haven't always thought of this as prayer, and I think that's been part of the fun of this series. I love how God has worked through different people and in different ways in people's lives. And I love hearing about it. When I talk to a person of color, or when I talk to a woman, or when I talk to someone who's part of the LGBTQ community, and they talk about how God can be liberating and empowering, I'm like, whoa, it's just different than the ways that I have experienced God. And I need that. I love to hear different sides of God from different people. It's like when you might have someone that and you have a mutual friend, and that person draws things out of both of you that you don't draw out yourself. There's different facets and ways you get to experience that person. And I love that. We learn more about God when we learn about God with other people and what they're experiencing and seeing and knowing about God. And I think openness in our relationship with God, it involves openness to learning new things about God and about each other, about allowing our relationships to change and to grow and to be honest in the midst of that. And all that is prayer.
Yeah, that's prayer. That's prayer. So wild. Okay, so good friendships and our relationship with God requires time, it requires openness, and I think it also requires thoughtfulness. So I mentioned earlier how my friend cared for me when I was experiencing something difficult. She was thoughtful in that moment. She's also been thoughtful in She'll send me e-gift cards sometimes if she knows I'm having a bad day, or even for my birthday or things like that. Those are ways that she cares for me, even when we're not together. It's just she's thinking about me, and she's expressing that by sending me this thing. Another way that this can happen in friendships is by sharing memes and reels. So this is like a no-cost situation, right? It doesn't require money to do this.
Okay.
Adam Grant is an organizational psychologist, and he's a person who's active on Instagram and other social media. And he writes this: sending memes, links, and videos to others isn't trivial. It signals that you're thinking of them and want them to share your joy. It's known as pebbling, based on penguins gifting pebbles to potential partners. Pebbling is an act of care. Every pebble is a bid for connection. So how might that like translate to our relationship with God and prayer?
I love that idea of pebbling. And I think we can do the same thing. We can make bids for connection with God, and those bids for connection with God are a form of prayer.
Yeah.
So that could look like, you're getting ready for a difficult meeting, and you know that this meeting is going to be hard. It could go sideways on you really easily. And so you're aware of your own limitations, and you're like, oh, God help me.
Yep.
As I prepare for this meeting. That's a bid. That's pebbling. That's thinking about God. Or it could be where you notice someone acting generously or doing something, that's really just or helpful for someone else. And in that moment, you're inspired by that other person and what they're doing. And you're like, maybe I want to do something like that too. Like I want to make a change. Or you see that and you think, wow, that's a reflection of the character of God. That's a bid. That's a pebbling in that moment. It could be when you see something beautiful and, there's a sense of calm or awe that fills you. And you think about how creative God is. You take that thing, whatever it might be, and you ascribe it to God, and voila, all of a sudden you've prayed in that moment. There's moments when you think about God and you think about God's character, and this is just helpful. We put this label on it that's a prayer. We don't always think about that, or maybe it's the beginning of a longer prayer. It's a bid for connection with God, and most of us are probably already doing this throughout our day, but we're just not thinking about it as prayer. I think about these bids, these pebblings, and there's moments when you're going through life and you do think about a friend, or you're like, oh, they might appreciate this, or you're at the store and you see something that they like, and you're like, oh my goodness, it totally makes me think of whoever the person is. I recently sent Jana a meme, and it's a meme about Aldi shopping carts. And if you don't shop at Aldi, the meme is utterly meaningless to you. But I know that Jana shops there. I know that Jana always gets a shopping cart. I know that she's got a whole little section in our car where she's got all the quarters that she needs for the Aldi shopping carts. And so I knew that I had that in my mind. And I also knew that most of the memes I send Jana, she just kind of rolls her eyes. But I sent her this meme about buying shopping carts at Aldi for 25 cents. And I got her to laugh out loud. And I know it because I could hear it from the other room in the house, even through a couple of closed doors. Now, those moments where you think about someone and you think about who they are and what they might enjoy, those are really like important moments for being a good friend. Those are important moments in a relationship with God of prayer, where you're taking the time to think about them, and there's a huge connection there that maybe we often miss.
Yeah. And like you said, I bet we're all already doing this, or at least we're like on our way to doing it. Like the more we think about God and practice the presence of God, like the more those connections are going to be made, and we're going to have those bids. And more than that, I think sometimes these are God's bids to us.
Ooh, yeah.
Like God's like wanting to connect with us. Because we already talked about God wants to be in relationship with us. And so, I mean, I'm not going to go so far as to say that God is creating a rainbow just for you, right? Like, but I do think there are times that God might be like, hey, look at that thing. Isn't that cool? And we have an opportunity to like connect with God and respond to that. And I find a lot of relief in this whole concept that we might be praying without knowing, because even as a pastor, I struggle to like be really consistent in those habits. I feel like I'm supposed to have it all figured out, and I don't. And I mean, I also struggle with some of those consistent habits, like in my people relationships, you know?
Yeah.
But recognizing that there's this wide range of how you can pray and ways that we're praying without even realizing it, it makes this whole thing just seem a little bit more attainable. Now, maybe someone listening today hears all of this and they're like, well, I still don't think I'm doing any of that. I still don't think that I'm praying as much as I should.
Yeah, I think the encouragement for someone like that today is, number one, we're all on a journey, and it's just going to require steps. And maybe one step is, I want to pray. I want to pray. You know, sometimes we're not able to say, I want this.
Right.
And at that point, all we can say is, I want this.
Yeah. That's big though.
That is. And acknowledging that is a prayer.
Yeah.
Right there. Again, we're expanding the ways we think about prayer. And as we wrap up this series, I want to take a moment to just encourage all of us that prayer doesn't have to be elaborate. It doesn't need to be smart. It doesn't need to be super coherent. As we said earlier, it could even involve swearing at God.
Right.
It doesn't need to be structured in a certain way to be just right for God to hear from us. We won't offend God. We won't offend God if we use the wrong words or say something taboo. Right. So try not to overthink prayer. Don't try too hard.
Right.
We started our series with a challenge, and the challenge was to try praying. Last week, we added another kind of layer to that challenge, and we challenged people to try praying differently.
Right.
This week, we have a final challenge, and it's, again, to try praying, but to try praying without overthinking it, without trying too hard.
Right.
We have a final chat question. That's this, I call it the paradox chat question, because we're going to invite you to think about praying without overthinking it. So see if you can hit the sweet spot on this final chat question. It's about, how can you make prayer bids this week? How can you notice God? Here's our final question for discussion. What is one way that you can try praying without overthinking it this week? Let's take a moment and let's talk about it.
So as I reflected on how to wrap up today's message, I thought about a book that I have on my shelf called A Rhythm of Prayer. And in that book, I found a poem by Amina Brown. She is a spoken word artist and poet, and she wrote a poem called, it's called She Said, How Do You Know When You're Hearing from God?
Ooh, okay.
So it's like a response that she wrote to a question someone asked, how do you know you're hearing from God? And it's all about listening to God and hearing from God in new places and in new ways, and like centering yourself. And I thought for just a minute about, like, what if I just read this prayer? And then I remembered that she's a performing artist and that it'd be so much more powerful to hear her perform it.
That makes sense.
It makes a lot of sense, right? And so that's how we're going to end today's message, with watching this video of her performing this prayer, this poem. And I just would say, like, it's about 3 minutes long, which on this side of it doesn't seem very long, but when you're watching it, it's going to feel kind of long, and you're not going to catch all of it.
No, there's no way.
There's no way that you're going to catch all of it. And so that's
so
okay.
Rich.
Just like listen for a couple of things that stand out to you, that like strike you. I think we're going to put the link to this video on our link tree so people can go watch it later if they have a desire to do that. But let's hear this prayer from Amina Brown.
And so here is my try at answering her question. This poem is called She Said. How do you know when you're hearing from God? She said, how do you know when you're hearing from God? I didn't know how to explain. It is to explain the butter grit of cornbread to a mouth that just discovered it has a tongue. The sound of jazz to ears that only ever thought they'd be lobes of flesh. The sight of sunsets to a blinded eye that in an instant can see to fail. At the ability to describe how the scent of baked bread can make the mind recall a memory. Every detail of a house, a room, a conversation. Like explaining to a newborn baby, this is what it feels like to be held. My words never felt so small, so useless, so incapable. I wanted to tell her. Put your hand in the center of your chest. Feel the rhythm there. I wanted to tell her you will find the holy text in so many places. On crinkly pages of scripture, in a dusty hymnal, in the creases of a grandmother's smile, the way she clasps her hands and prays familiar, as if to dignitary and friend, the way she sings a simple song from her spirit, turns her porch into a cathedral. I learned from my great-grandmother how to pray, how to talk to God, how to listen. Watching her and the other silver-haired church mothers gather in her living room. See, they prayed living room prayers because you don't have to be inside the four walls of a church to cry out to the God who made you, and despite what the laws say or what our human flaws say, God's ears don't play favorites. God's ears don't assess bank accounts or social status for they attune themselves to the story your tears or your fears are telling. God's ears are here for the babies, for the dreamers, for the immigrant and the refugee, for the orphan and the widow, for the depressed and the lonely, for the oppressed, for those about to make a mess or caught in the middle of cleaning one up. See, dirt don't scare God's ears. God is a gardener. God knows full well it takes rain and sun and soil to make things grow. I wanted to tell her, if you want to experience God, you have to be willing to experience what's holy in the places so many people don't even deem to be sacred, that sometimes God sits next to you on a bar stool, spilling truth to you like too many beers, that God knows full well the dance we do and we love ourselves so little that just about anyone will do, that God cares about the moments we find ourselves on the edge of a cliff, on the edge of sanity, on the edge of society. I wanted to tell her how God is always waiting, lingering after the doors close and the phone doesn't ring and we are finally alone, how God is always saying, I love you, I'm here, don't go, stay, please, how God is always pleading with us to trust, to love, to listen, how God's voice is all thunder and whisper and bass lines and grace. Sometimes when I pray, I think about her, how the voice of God was lingering in her very question, how just like so many of us, like you, like me, like her, still doubting, still searching, still questioning. I know I don't have all the answers. I know I never will. Maybe the best thing I can do is put my hand in the center of my chest, feel the rhythm there, turn down the noise in our minds and our lives and whisper, God, whatever you want to say, I'm here, I'm listening.